You know, I've often wondered if there's a Guinness World Record for the most unnecessary, over-the-top emergency response triggered by a single individual's spectacular meltdown. If there is, I think my neighbor, let's call her Karen Prime, might just be a contender. And the truly delicious chef's kiss part of this whole saga? My wife was the 911 dispatcher who took the call. Oh, you're going to want to stick around for this one, folks. It's a doozy. Go ahead and drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. Because this story of suburban warfare, or rather, rural ranch versus encroaching entitlement, is one for the ages. It all started, as these things often do, with a little bit of peace and quiet being shattered by the arrival of someone who believed the world revolved around their whims. I own a decent-sized ranch, a couple of 100 acres of rolling hills, creek beds, and old-growth oak that's been in my family for 3 generations. It's my sanctuary, my business. I run cattle and have a small organic farming operation, and my home. I'm a retired civil engineer, so I appreciate order, well-defined boundaries, and things making logical sense. My wife, Sarah, works as an emergency dispatcher for the county. A high-stress job, but she's incredible at it. Calm under pressure, decisive, and with an almost supernatural ability to sift truth from panic-stricken babble. You'll see just how good she is. The trouble began when a new, rather pretentious housing development sprouted up along one edge of my property line. They called it Whispering Pines Estates, though the only whispering was probably the sound of Old Man Henderson, my predecessor, spinning in his grave at the sight of these McMansions on their tiny, manicured lots. And with Whispering Pines came its HOA, and with the HOA came its self-appointed queen, Karen Prime. Karen, whose real name was probably something innocuous like Susan or Jennifer, drove a gleaming white Range Rover that rarely saw a speck of dust, despite the gravel access road to her mini palace. She had that helmet of blonde hair that looked like it could deflect small arms fire, a permanent expression of distaste, and a wardrobe that screamed golf club luncheon even when she was just getting her mail. Our initial interactions were, shall we say, strained. She'd complain about the smell of cow manure, which, to be fair, is a thing when you live next to a cattle ranch. I'd politely point out the ranch was there first by about 70 years. She'd fuss about the sound of my tractor early in the morning. I'd explain that farming, like the sun, waits for no one. I even had to gently correct her once when she tried to tell me my fence was 3 feet onto HOA common land. Being an engineer with a lifelong passion for surveying, I had my property lines plotted down to the millimeter, backed by county records and GPS data. I showed her the official plat map. She huffed and said, "Well, it looks wrong." That was Karen Prime in a nutshell. Feelings over facts, especially when the facts inconvenienced her. I'm a patient man. I believe in being a good neighbor. But Karen seemed to view my property not as a working ranch, but as an untamed wilderness that existed solely to inconvenience her aesthetic sensibilities and her delusion of grandeur. She'd taken to calling the sheriff's non-emergency line for the most trivial things, a loose strand of barbed wire on my side of the fence, which I'd fix within hours of noticing anyway, the alarming sight of my old bull Ferdinand grazing peacefully near the property line, or even dust kicked up by my truck on my own dirt roads. Each time, a deputy would sigh, drive out, take a look, and tell her there was no issue. It was becoming a running joke down at the station, or so Sarah told me, with a weary smile. The other residents of Whispering Pines were a mixed bag. Some were perfectly pleasant, even apologetic for Karen's behavior. They'd wave if they saw me, and a couple had even bought produce from my farm stand. Others, however, seemed to be firmly under Karen's thumb, a sort of beige-clad chorus of enablers who nodded along to her pronouncements at HOA meetings, probably too intimidated or too apathetic to challenge her. They were the ones who allowed her to feel like the undisputed monarch of her little subdivision kingdom, a kingdom she clearly felt should extend its dominion over my ancestral lands. Little did she know, her reign was about to encounter a rather significant constitutional crisis, orchestrated by yours truly and, inadvertently at first, by my very own Sarah. The stage was being set for a confrontation, and Karen, bless her entitled heart, was about to bring a metaphorical bullhorn to a chess match. The slow burn of Karen's passive aggression had been simmering for months. I'd installed a few extra "no trespassing" signs along the boundary with whispering pines. Not that I thought they'd deter someone as brazen as her, but more to establish a clear legal baseline. As a civil engineer, documentation is second nature. I also made sure my liability insurance was up to date, a good practice for any landowner, but especially when you have a Karen lurking on your borders. My ranch is crisscrossed with old deer trails and utility easements, and while I'm generally tolerant of respectful hikers who ask permission, Karen was not the type to ask, nor to be respectful. Sarah had mentioned a few training sessions at dispatch about handling sovereign citizen types and those with extreme entitlement complexes. She said it was like Karen's photo was on the training slides. One of the more irritating, though thankfully infrequent, occurrences was finding discarded latte cups or designer dog waste bags just inside my fence line. It was petty, infuriating, and almost certainly Karen's handiwork, though proving it was nigh impossible. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, or perhaps 1,000 artisanal coffee containers. I'd even found one of her perfectly manicured garden gnomes, a particularly smug-looking fellow, placed defiantly on a fence post on my side of the line. I relocated him to the county dump. I sometimes wondered if she was trying to provoke a reaction, to create an incident that would allow her to play the victim and rally the HOA against the unruly rancher. If so, she was about to get her wish, though not in the way she imagined. The groundwork for her dramatic overreach was being meticulously laid, brick by entitled brick, and the foundation was her own breathtaking arrogance. She consistently underestimated me, seeing me as some kind of uncultured yokel, despite my professional background and the fact that I could probably buy and sell her little plot 5 times over. That underestimation, as you'll see, was a critical error on her part. The incident that finally tipped the scales from simmering annoyance to full-blown farce happened on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was out on the far western stretch of my property, an area that bordered a thickly wooded section of the Whispering Pines common land. This particular patch of my ranch included a small spring-fed pond that was vital for my livestock, especially during the drier months. I was checking the fence line there, a routine task, making sure there were no breaks that could let my cattle wander or, more pertinently, let unwanted visitors in. The leaves were turning, gold and crimson, and the air was sharp and clean. It was the kind of day that made you glad to be alive and working outdoors. That peace, however, was about to be rudely interrupted by a splash of aggressively bright pink athleisure wear moving through the trees on my side of the fence. I squinted. Sure enough, it was Karen Prime. She was clambering around near the edge of my pond, phone in hand, snapping pictures. Not just of the pond, but seemingly of the surrounding vegetation, the fence posts, even the muddy bank where my cows like to drink. She was a good 50 yards inside my property line, a line clearly marked with a sturdy barbed wire fence and at least 2 prominent no trespassing signs within her immediate vicinity. My first thought, I'll admit, was a surge of pure, unadulterated irritation. My second thought, more pragmatically, was to get my own phone out and start recording. If there's one thing my engineering career taught me, it's that data is king. Video evidence is the emperor. I walked towards her, not aggressively, but steadily. Afternoon, Karen. I called out when I was about 20 feet away. Bit far from home, aren't you? She jumped, startled, and spun around, nearly dropping her phone into the mud. Her face, when she saw me, went through a rapid series of emotions. Surprise, then annoyance, then that familiar haughty indignation. This is HOA property, she declared, her voice a little shaky but rapidly gaining its usual strident tone. I'm conducting an environmental survey. I stopped a few feet from her, making sure my phone was clearly capturing her and the fence line behind her, indisputably on my land. Actually, Karen, I said, keeping my voice calm and level, this is very much my property. The HOA land ends back there, beyond that fence you just climbed over. You're trespassing. I gestured towards the fence. And I believe those signs are quite clear. Nonsense, she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Our documents clearly show this pond as a shared resource. It's probably feeding runoff into our pristine common areas. She looked genuinely affronted, as if my pond was personally victimizing her manicured Bermuda grass. My pond, my runoff, my land, I reiterated, my patience wearing thin. I've dealt with my share of difficult contractors and obstinate bureaucrats in my engineering days, but Karen's sheer denial of physical reality was in a league of its own. I have the plat maps, the survey markers, everything. You are trespassing. I'd appreciate it if you'd return to your side of the fence. Her eyes narrowed. This was the point where a normal person might feel a twinge of embarrassment, perhaps even offer an apology. Not Karen Prime. I don't have to go anywhere, she snapped. You can't intimidate me. I know my rights. Then, with a dramatic flourish that would have done a silent film star proud, she whipped out her phone again. I'm calling 911. You're threatening me. Threatening her? I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't moved aggressively, hadn't done anything other than state facts on my own land. I almost laughed. Go right ahead, Karen, I said, a small, grim smile playing on my lips. Tell them all about it. Inside, a little spark of amusement ignited. Sarah was on duty today. This was going to be interesting. I could already picture Sarah at her console, headset on, that look of weary professionalism masking an internal eye roll as the call came through. Karen stabbed at her phone screen, then held it to her ear. Her voice, now laced with a theatrical tremor, carried clearly in the still afternoon air. 911. What's your emergency? I heard faintly from her earpiece, and then Karen launched into her performance. Yes, I need help immediately. I'm being threatened by a hostile man on HOA property. He's trying to drive me off. I'm near the Whispering Pines common area by the disputed pond. Her eyes flicked towards me, a little glint of triumph in them. She clearly thought she had me. Oh, Karen, you sweet, misguided, trespassing fool. You have no idea. My own phone was still recording, capturing her every word, her every dramatic gesture, all set against the backdrop of my clearly marked property. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was rapidly approaching comedic gold. As Karen continued her dramatic monologue to the 911 operator, who I knew was my dear wife Sarah, I leaned against a sturdy oak tree, crossed my arms, and adopted an expression of mild curiosity. It was quite the performance. Karen was claiming I was aggressive, menacing, and that she felt acutely unsafe. She painted a picture of a damsel in distress, cornered by a brute. The reality, of course, was a middle-aged woman in Lululemon, trespassing on private property, being politely asked to leave by the landowner, who was, at that moment, probably looking more bored than brutish. Yes, he's right here, she exclaimed into the phone, gesturing towards me with a flourish. He's got tools. He could be dangerous. The tools in question were a pair of fencing pliers and a small hammer tucked into my belt, standard equipment for checking fence lines. Hardly instruments of terror, unless you're a particularly stubborn fence staple. I later got the full blow-by-blow from Sarah about her end of the call, and it was everything I imagined and more. She told me her console lit up, and the caller ID, while not immediately flagging Karen's home number, she was, after all, out in the wilds of my back 40, did show a cell pinging very close to our address. When Karen started her spiel, Sarah said she recognized the voice almost instantly. That particular brand of shrill entitlement was apparently quite distinctive. Okay, ma'am, Sarah had said, her voice the epitome of calm professionalism, the kind she used for everything from fender benders to full-blown domestic disputes. Can you describe the man for me? Karen launched into a description that made me sound like a cross between a lumberjack berserker and a Bond villain. He's large, very intimidating, and he's glaring at me. He claims this land is his, but it's clearly part of Whispering Pines. And you said he has tools, ma'am? Sarah asked, her pen probably poised. I could almost hear the subtle internal sigh. What kind of tools are we talking about? Farming tools, Karen declared, as if that made them inherently sinister. Sharp ones? He's clearly agitated that I've discovered his encroachment. Sarah, bless her heart, played it absolutely by the book, but with a delicious undercurrent of what I can only describe as malicious compliance in its most subtle form. All right, ma'am. Please try to remain calm. Officers are being informed of the situation. Are you in an immediate physical altercation? Not yet, Karen hissed. But he's trying to force me to leave. He's violating my rights to access community property. I understand, ma'am, Sarah said, her voice smooth as silk. Can you tell me exactly where you are? You mentioned a pond near Whispering Pines? Sarah knew my property layout like the back of her hand. She knew exactly which pond Karen was talking about, and knew, therefore, that Karen was unequivocally trespassing. But her job wasn't to litigate property disputes over the 911 line. It was to assess threat and dispatch accordingly. Back on my side of the fence, Karen was starting to look a little impatient. She kept glancing down the dirt track that led from the main road, expecting, no doubt, a phalanx of squad cars to come roaring to her rescue, sirens blazing. I, meanwhile, had actually pulled out my water bottle and taken a leisurely sip. I might have even checked my watch. This subtle display of unconcern seemed to gall her more than any angry outburst could have. They're taking their time, she muttered, more to herself than to me, before putting the phone back to her ear. Hello? Are you still there? Are the officers on their way? This man is becoming more insolent. Sarah, on the other end, would later tell me she was inputting the call details, flagging it as a dispute, possible trespass, but not, at this stage, a high-priority emergency. Karen wasn't reporting an active assault, just a verbal disagreement and a refusal to leave what she thought was public land. Yes, ma'am, I'm still here, Sarah had assured her. The information has been passed to dispatch. Please stay on the line if you can and try to maintain a safe distance. A safe distance? Karen shrieked, making me jump slightly. He's cornered me. This is an outrage. I am a pillar of this community. I demand action. This is where things started to get truly interesting. Karen, fueled by her own indignation and the perceived lack of immediate, fawning response from the emergency services, decided to up the ante. She was pacing now, a caged panther in overpriced yoga pants. Her voice on the phone became more frantic, more hysterical. He's not just trespassing, he's got a look in his eye. He's unhinged. I think he might be armed. I'm in mortal danger here. You need to send everyone. I don't feel safe. He's a large, dangerous man. I need a helicopter. I need SWAT. He's really, really dangerous. I think he's one of those sovereign citizen types. You need to send a special forces team. I could practically hear Sarah's eyebrows shooting up into her hairline from half a mile away. Karen was no longer reporting a simple trespass or a verbal dispute. She was now claiming to be in imminent, life-threatening danger from a heavily armed, unhinged individual, and was specifically requesting a massive, multi-agency response. That, as Sarah knew, changed everything. When a caller explicitly states they are in mortal danger and requests specific, high-level interventions like air support and tactical teams, protocol dictates a shift in response. You can't just ignore that, even if you suspect the caller is, to put it mildly, prone to exaggeration. You have to take it at face value until proven otherwise, especially if the caller is persistent and escalating their claims of immediate threat. Sarah, ever the professional, would have noted every single one of Karen's escalating claims. Ma'am, she'd have said, her voice still calm, but perhaps a shade more serious to match Karen's purported level of crisis. You're stating that you believe the individual is armed, and that you are in mortal danger, and you are requesting an airlift and special tactical units? Yes, didn't you hear me? Karen shrieked. He's going to do something terrible. I can feel it. Hurry! All right, ma'am, Sarah would have replied, her fingers flying across her keyboard. Given your assessment of the severe and immediate threat, We are escalating the response accordingly. Please try to find a safe place if you can and stay on the line." On my end, I saw Karen's face contort into a grimace of what she probably thought was terrified anticipation, but which looked more like someone who'd bitten into a very sour lemon. She lowered the phone slightly, a smug, almost triumphant glint in her eyes as she looked at me. "They're sending everyone," she announced, her voice filled with vindictive satisfaction. "You're in big trouble now, Buster. They know how dangerous you are." I just raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous, Karen? Really? With my fencing pliers?" But a new sound was beginning to permeate the quiet afternoon air. A faint, distant thrumming. It was a sound I knew well from my time on large engineering projects near urban centers or, occasionally, from wildfire season. It was the sound of a helicopter. And it was getting closer. Karen Prime had demanded the cavalry, and it appeared my wife, adhering strictly to the desperate pleas of a citizen in mortal peril, was about to give it to her, with bells on, and probably a rather large bill to follow. The distant thrumming grew louder, resolving itself into the unmistakable rhythmic whump 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 of a helicopter. Karen's head snapped up, a flicker of genuine surprise, quickly morphing into triumphant vindication, crossing her face. "See?" she crowed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me, as if I were personally responsible for doubting her gravitas. "I told you it was serious. They wouldn't send a helicopter if it wasn't serious." I just watched, a slow smile spreading across my face. Oh, this was going to be rich. The chopper, a county sheriff's Bell Jet Ranger, crested the tree line, did a slow circle over my pond, its downdraft ruffling the water and flattening the tall grass, then another, wider circle encompassing the scene. It was like something out of a movie, if the movie was about the world's most overblown response to a woman complaining about cow-adjacent scenery. Then came the sirens. Not just one, but multiple. A chorus of wails growing louder as they approached from the main road, then turned onto my long driveway. First to arrive was a sheriff's cruiser, lights flashing, kicking up a plume of dust. It skidded to a halt a respectful distance away. Then another, and another. Soon, there were no fewer than 4 sheriff's vehicles, plus a fish and wildlife warden's truck, presumably because of the pond and Karen's vague environmental survey claims. And, bringing up the rear, a large fire department ambulance, its lights pulsing rhythmically, parking a little further back in a staging position. It was quite the parade. I half expected a SWAT van to come barreling in next. Karen was practically vibrating with excitement and self-importance. She puffed out her chest, ready to receive her rescuers and direct them to the villain, me. The deputies fanned out, their expressions serious, hands near their sidearms. One, a burly sergeant I vaguely recognized, a guy named Miller, approached me first, while 2 others moved cautiously towards Karen, who was now gesturing wildly and talking a mile a minute. "Afternoon, sir," Sergeant Miller said, his eyes taking in me, my innocuous fencing tools, my still recording phone, and the general peacefulness of the scene, which was starkly at odds with the level of emergency response currently unfolding. "We received a call about a disturbance, a possible armed individual threatening a citizen." "Afternoon, Sergeant," I replied calmly. "The only disturbance here is that this lady," I nodded towards Karen, who was now loudly explaining to the other deputies how I had terrorized her, "climbed over my clearly marked fence and is trespassing on my private property. I asked her to leave. She then called 911, claiming I was threatening her with these." I held up my fencing pliers. "She also, apparently, told your dispatcher I was armed and dangerous and demanded a helicopter and special forces, or so she just informed me." I kept my tone even, factual. My phone was still discreetly recording the entire interaction. Sergeant Miller's gaze flickered to Karen, then back to me. I could see a muscle twitch in his jaw. He was a seasoned officer. He'd seen his share of nonsense. "Your property, you say? Do you have documentation?" "Right here," I said, pulling a laminated copy of my plat map from my back pocket, along with my driver's license. "Survey markers are all in place. Fence line is accurate. Been this way for 70 years. He took the map, glanced at it, then at the fence line, then at Karen, who was now pointing dramatically at the pond. One of the deputies with her was starting to look distinctly unimpressed. The helicopter completed another pass overhead, then seemed to move into a holding pattern a little further off, its thrumming a constant backdrop to the absurdity. The deputies talking to Karen were clearly trying to get a coherent story out of her, but she was all over the place. He was menacing. He has weapons. This pond is a vital ecological resource for whispering pines. He's trying to hoard it. He's dangerous. I tell you, dangerous. I heard her shriek. Sergeant Miller listened to his radio for a moment, then turned back to me. She's claiming you threatened to, and I quote, unleash your attack bull on her if she didn't leave. I blinked. My attack bull? Ferdinand? He's about 20 years old and moves slower than molasses in January. And he's in a completely different pasture, half a mile away. Besides, I wouldn't threaten anyone with Ferdinand. He's a sweetheart. Mostly naps. A small chuckle escaped me. The sheer audacity of her fabrications was almost impressive. The sergeant allowed himself a very faint smile. Right. He then walked over to confer with the deputies who had been interviewing Karen. I saw them gesturing, Karen interrupting, the deputies shaking their heads. The atmosphere was slowly shifting from high alert tension to one of dawning, weary realization on the part of the officers. The sheer scale of the response, the helicopter, multiple units, the ambulance on standby, was beginning to look less like a necessary precaution and more like an expensive folly. All thanks to Karen's dramatic pronouncements to the 911 dispatcher, my wife, who, I was certain, had meticulously logged every single one of Karen's increasingly unhinged demands for overwhelming force. Karen had wanted a show of force, and Sarah had simply ensured the county provided exactly what was requested, based on the caller's own words about the perceived threat level. The beauty of it was its perfect adherence to procedure, even if the premise was utterly ludicrous. After a few more minutes of hushed, then slightly more forceful conversation with Karen, Sergeant Miller strode back towards me, his face set in an expression of weary resignation. The other deputies were now trying to gently guide a still protesting Karen back towards the fence line and, presumably, off my property. The helicopter, as if sensing a shift in the dramatic tension, began a slow, circling descent towards a nearby open field, clearly not intending an emergency evacuation. Well, sir, Sergeant Miller began, letting out a long breath, it appears there's been a significant misunderstanding of the situation, primarily on the part of Ms. Albright. He used her actual name, which I filed away for future reference. So, Karen Prime was a Ms. Albright. Good to know. We've determined you are indeed the rightful property owner, and she was, in fact, trespassing. I figured as much, I said, allowing a small, satisfied smile. Glad we could clear that up. However, Miller continued, and his tone became a bit sterner, though not directed at me. The nature of Miss Albright's 911 call, specifically her claims of being in mortal danger, her assertion that you were armed and making direct threats, and her explicit demands for a high-level emergency response, including air support and tactical units, has triggered a rather substantial deployment of county resources. He gestured vaguely at the assembled vehicles and the now idling helicopter. Karen, who had been momentarily subdued, seemed to perk up at this, perhaps thinking she was about to be vindicated. Exactly. It was a serious situation. She interjected loudly from near the fence, where a deputy was patiently trying to explain property law to her. Miller ignored her and focused on me, though his words were clearly for her benefit as well. When a caller reports an immediate, life-threatening situation and requests specific assets like a helicopter due to, and I'm quoting the dispatcher's log here, extreme fear for her life from a potentially armed and violent individual, we are obligated to respond in kind. We can't second-guess that in the moment. However, when that report turns out to be significantly exaggerated or frankly fabricated, there are consequences. A different kind of silence fell, punctuated only by the distant idling of the helicopter. Karen Albright's face began to lose some of its smugness. Consequences? She squeaked. her voice suddenly much smaller. "Yes, ma'am," Miller said, turning to face her directly now. His voice was firm, official. "This response today: 4 sheriff's units, a fish and wildlife officer, an ambulance crew on standby, and the county helicopter, represents a significant expenditure of taxpayer money and has diverted resources from other potential emergencies. Given that our investigation shows no evidence of a credible threat from Mr. Henderson here, and ample evidence that you were trespassing and then knowingly filed a false report exaggerating the danger to an extreme degree, you will be receiving a citation for misuse of the 911 system. Furthermore," he paused for effect, "the county has a cost recovery ordinance for demonstrably false or grossly negligent activations of major emergency services. You will be billed for the operational costs of the helicopter flight time and a portion of the other deployed assets." Karen's jaw dropped. Her face went from indignant pink to a rather alarming shade of pale gray. "Billed? Billed for what? I was in danger. This is an outrage. You can't do this." "Oh, we absolutely can, ma'am," Miller stated flatly. "The dispatcher, who I must say did an exemplary job of documenting your escalating claims and your specific requests, has a full recording. Your insistence on the severity of the threat and your demand for a helicopter directly led to this level of response. Had you simply reported a trespass or a disagreement, a single unit would have been dispatched. You cried wolf, Miss Albright, and a very expensive wolf showed up." The deputy next to her handed her a couple of pieces of paper, likely the citation, and a preliminary notice about the impending bill for services rendered. Karen stared at them as if they were venomous snakes. The triumphant glint was long gone, replaced by a dawning horror. The sheer, delicious irony was almost too much to bear. She had wanted to bring the full weight of authority down on me, and instead, it was about to land squarely in her lap, or rather, her bank account. The officers began to pack up. The ambulance crew, looking faintly bored, started their engine. The helicopter pilot gave a brief wave and began to lift off, the thwump, thwump, thwump receding into the afternoon sky. One by one, the sheriff's cruisers pulled away, leaving just Sergeant Miller, Karen, and me. Miller gave Karen a final, stern warning about trespassing and the severe penalties for future false reports, then tipped his hat to me. "Have a good day, Mr. Henderson. Sorry for the circus." "You too, Sergeant," I said, trying to suppress a grin. "And no apology necessary. It was educational." Once Miller's cruiser disappeared down the drive, Karen Albright stood there, alone, clutching her citations, looking utterly deflated. The Queen had been dethroned, not by a peasant revolt, but by her own hubris and a meticulously followed emergency protocol. She shot me one last venomous glare, then, without a word, turned and scrambled back over the fence, this time with considerably less aplomb, and practically ran back towards the dubious sanctuary of Whispering Pines Estates. My phone, I realized, was still recording. I hit stop. That footage, along with the official 911 recordings and the officers' body cam videos, would be quite the collection. Later that evening, Sarah came home looking tired but with a distinct sparkle in her eye. "Rough day at the office, honey?" I asked, pouring her a glass of wine. "You have no idea," she said, taking a large sip. "Or maybe you do. I heard there was some excitement out your way. Something involving a lady, a pond, and a rather insistent request for air support?" I grinned. "You could say that. So, Ms. Albright really did demand a special forces team?" Sarah chuckled, a genuine hearty laugh. "Oh yes. Amongst other things. She painted you as a clear and present danger to national security, practically. Claimed she was in mortal peril. Said she needed an airlift and tactical backup. When someone uses those kinds of phrases and insists on that level of threat, protocol is pretty clear. We give them what they say they need, and we document it thoroughly." She took another sip of wine. The supervising officer listened to the tapes. He agreed it was a textbook case for cost recovery. Apparently, the preliminary estimate for the helicopter alone is going to be several $1,000s, not to mention the fines for misuse of 911. We clinked glasses. To Karen Prime, I said. May her checkbook feel the full weight of her folly. The aftermath was, as you might expect, rather satisfying. Word travels fast in small communities, even ones as disparate as a working ranch and a pretentious housing development. The story of Karen Albright's very public, very expensive meltdown became the stuff of local legend almost overnight. Other residents of Whispering Pines, the ones who had previously been too timid to speak up, started to find their voices. There were whispers of an emergency HOA meeting, calls for Karen's resignation from whatever self-appointed committees she lorded over. Her credibility, already shaky, was now utterly shot. Apparently, being presented with a bill from the county for a 5-figure sum for crying wolf does wonders for one's humility, or at least one's public image. I heard through the grapevine, specifically from a much friendlier neighbor in Whispering Pines who started buying eggs from me, that Karen tried to fight the bill. She hired a lawyer, claimed she was genuinely terrified that the dispatcher had entrapped her, but the recordings were irrefutable. Her own words, her own escalating demands, her own fabrications, all laid bare. The county, armed with Sarah's meticulous logs and the officer's reports, held firm. Karen Albright paid. Through the nose. For my part, life on the ranch returned to its usual peaceful rhythm, albeit with a slightly more amusing anecdote to tell. I strengthened the fencing along that western stretch, more as a symbolic gesture than anything else. I haven't seen Karen near my property lines since. In fact, I rarely see her out at all. Her Range Rover stays mostly in its garage. Perhaps she's taken up indoor hobbies. One can only hope. The broader positive change was a subtle but noticeable shift in the HOA's attitude. The pettiness seemed to dial down a notch. Maybe they realized that not all their neighbors were going to roll over for their more outlandish demands. Or maybe they just didn't want to end up footing another bill for Karen's theatrics. So, that's the story of how my wife, the unflappable 911 dispatcher, helped serve up a 5-figure slice of humble pie to an HOA Karen who flew too close to the sun on wings of pure entitlement. It just goes to show, sometimes the system, when navigated with a bit of calm logic and a healthy respect for protocol, can work in wonderfully ironic ways. What's the craziest HOA story or misuse of emergency services you've ever encountered? Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this tale of righteous reckoning, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. You never know what kind of suburban or rural drama will unfold next.